So we are here with the conclusion of the Blood Hunt event from Marvel Comics, and yes, Doctor Doom becomes Sorcerer Supreme, and it's amazing. So what this does is this picks up with what's basically the Temple of the First Blasphemy within the city of New York. And a little bit of a refresher for those of you guys who don't really remember everything that happened so far, the long and short of it was that for reasons that were not fully explained, but they will be in this particular video, Blade had effectively seized control of the vampire nation from Dracula and then took control of the Dark Force energy that exists in Marvel Comics. The Dark Force energy is literally a dimension of pure darkness. Light cannot penetrate it. And so by seizing control of that, Blade blanketed the world in the Dark Force energy itself. Not that dissimilar from like when humanity blocked out the sun in the Matrix, right? It's basically the same thing. Sun doesn't get through and it allows vampires to just run amok throughout the world. Now, 99% of the tie-ins for this event were just other superheroes fighting vampires. None of the tie-ins were very interesting, but the big idea here is that with this newfound power, Blade had single-handedly taken out most everybody. The Avengers were on the ropes, Thor was incapacitated, Black Panther's been captured, and so what we do is we switch over to Doctor Strange. Now, Doctor Strange is currently in his spiritual form, the reason being because his physical body was turned into a vampire, so Clea literally pulled his spirit out of his body, and now it just roams around functioning as Doctor Strange, and they go to visit Doctor Doom. Now, here's the cool thing that goes on here, right? Victor Von Doom is the guy you go to in times like these, and the reason for that is because you kind of get this sort of back and forth between what's happening with Blade and Black Panther and those guys, and what's happening with Doctor Doom, because they're both basically offering expositions, and so what you find out here is that Blade is not actually Blade. That Blade is possessed by the spirit of a being named Varnae. Now, here's the issue with this whole idea of Varnae. The most you get in this story is where Black Panther, who's still being held captive by Blade, albeit having been bitten, he's supposed to turn into a vampire. We'll find out why he doesn't. That he asks Blade who he is, and Blade says that he's actually the very first. Now, the funny thing about this is when I read this, I just read the first Black Panther, and I was like, what? They're making him a Black Panther? But no, it's just the first Black Panther. Basically like, I am the first vampire. Now, here's the cool thing. Here's why I say this is a bit of a problem, because that's all you get here, right? Varnae, and that's basically it. But Varnae actually has a really interesting history in Marvel Comics. Specifically, it goes back to a couple of different issues. Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme, issues 11 and 18. And what these stories said was that in the pre-cataclysmic era, which is to say, before the Celestials came back to Earth, obliterated the Deviants, and sunk Atlantis and almost all the world with it, that Varnae was just a sorcerer, but started dabbling in what was effectively hell magic, basically the Darkhold, and dabbling into the powers of Chthon. This turned Varnae into a vampire, and that was the very first to ever exist in Marvel. In the Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme comics, there came a point where Varnae basically stepped down and handed the mantle over to Count Dracula. And then when Doctor Strange went to war against the vampire nation in the old Doctor Strange comics, this basically decimated the ranks of the vampires. And it's why over the years in Marvel, if you've been reading that side, the vampire race is almost just kind of hodgepodge, right? Just sort of limping through existence and always talking about how great their race used to be at one point in time. And so with those two things combined here, what we're basically getting is the fact that Varnae is seeking to return to power, but without an actual body, it seized control of the body of Blade. And that's what really Doctor Doom explains to everybody here when he says, some years ago, Varnae's minion, Marie Laveau, prepared Blade as the host for the spirit of Varnae. Apparently, the Daywalker's unique constitution made him the ideal vessel. That attempt failed, but it would appear that a second did not. Now, this first attempt that Dr. Doom is referring to is from Blade the Vampire Hunter number 5. That was a comic back in 1994 from Ian Edgington, and basically it was a story where literally Blade was going to be turned into a vessel for Varnae. And it's one of the reasons why we've never really explained Varnae too much, because there really isn't a whole lot to go on. Varnae's not that dissimilar from like Chthon, right? Just out there always trying to find a new host body. But the fact that Blade can walk around in the daylight through a combination of having been turned into a vampire, and then actually his ability to walk around in the daylight, a result of him being bitten by Michael Morbius. Yes, that Michael Morbius from that terrible film that Sony made. That it basically makes him the perfect host, right? He can just sort of solidify his control of the vampire nation, have all the strengths of a vampire and none of the weaknesses in his physical form. And so in this conversation between Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, that Strange says like, the sky skies are the weakness here, right? The sun has to shine once again. We have to find a way to remove that dark force energy. If it's gone, then that will destroy all the vampires immediately, and those who don't die will retreat to places where the sun doesn't touch, underground, right? Probably in some castle somewhere, most likely the home of Paul at Heavy Spoilers. But the bigger point here is that Dr. Doom kind of says, yes, right? I have precautions for the dark force energy as well. It was only a matter of time before this happened. People have trifled with the dark force dimension for far too long and far too lightly for something like this to have even remotely been a surprise. And it's a cool thing because that's true. The dark force dimension has been used by a variety of people who can both tap into it naturally and tap into it artificially, and people have used it for a variety of purposes. It was only a matter of time before somebody came along and said, what would happen if we united all those people or forced them to use their powers against their will and cover the world in darkness? What would happen, right? And that's literally what's going on here. But the kicker is that Clea says, well, if this involves magic, then let's get to it. And the response of Victor is no, right? A great assemblage of mages to begin with, Clea Strange, a grand array of magical creatures brought together as one. And where Stephen says, I am acquainted with a great many magicians, I can assemble them, the response of Stephen is, oh, no need. I have already taken the liberty of recruiting the student body of your strange academy. Now, Stephen, give it to me and let us begin. Now, here's the cool thing about Strange Academy. I forgot this team existed. For those of you guys who don't know about Strange Academy, it's basically the Doctor Strange version of the Young Avengers or New Mutants. You have the son of Dormammu, the kid with his head on fire. It's cool. We covered the original story. It was really, really awesome. But the thing that Dr. Doom is talking about here when he says, give it to me, Stephen doesn't know what he's referencing. And Doctor Strange says, give me the power of the Sorcerer Supreme. It's the only way for me to pull this off. And so again, switching back over to Asgard itself, because one of the things to keep in mind, you've got a multifaceted approach to basically dealing with what's going on regarding Blade and everything with the Vampire Nation, that you have the Avengers themselves that are going to go back on the offensive against Blade and his forces after having just been crushed, as well as Doctor Strange and Clea working with Doctor Doom, and small little stories here and there where folks are just fighting vampires. You've also got Hunter's Moon and Tigra. Now, the reason why they matter is that Tigra was brought into Jed MacKay's Moon Knight run when he originally did it. It's a phenomenal story. We covered it, probably the best Moon Knight has been in a couple of decades in Marvel. And then you have Hunter's Moon, who was introduced as what was actually another fist of Khonshu that we didn't know about before. It was pretty fantastic. But what these two are doing is they are on the hunt for Khonshu himself. The reason being because for those of you guys who followed our coverage of that Avengers story from way back in the day, where basically Moon Knight became the Phoenix, he fought Khonshu, defeated Khonshu, and Khonshu was locked away in an Asgardian prison. And it was a way for Marvel to just remove the character of Khonshu from the landscape and allow Moon Knight to just kind of do his own thing. It was a really cool way to explore Mark Spector's character without Moon Knight lording over his head. That's what goes into Jed MacKay's run. It's really, 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 really cool. And so with Hunter's Moon and them arriving here on the scene, that of course Khonshu immediately recognizes Hunter's Moon and he says, my loving son, so kind to visit your father, but foolish I fear. I have no power to lend you in opening my cell, and you have no key for these locks. And the response of Hunter's Moon is, you are correct, father. I have no power to open this door. I have no key, but I have brought something better. What better tool to open an Asgardian prison than an Asgardian crowbar? Because they brought the Wrecker. Now, we don't have to go super in-depth into Dirk Gerthwaite. He's a cool character, but him being the Wrecker and the significance of it goes back to Thor 148 from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1966 or 67, I think. The overall gist is that he was accidentally empowered with Asgardian magic by a woman named Carnilla who thought he was Loki. And when he fought Thor ultimately defeated him, but it turned out the magical power that he had was basically imbued in his crowbar. And that's why they brought him here, because he in turn prized this lock open, this whole cell. And what ends up happening is Khonshu finally breaks free after having been imprisoned for quite some time. Now, this is one of those moments in Marvel Comics that they do in crossovers where they kind of just decide Moon Knight's been his own thing long enough. And specifically, he died at the end of Jed MacKay's run, as awesome as it was. And so what's going to happen following this is Moon Knight returns, right? Khonshu goes back to being the god of the moon that basically manipulates Moon Knight, and it's just business as usual for Mark Spector's character. And so what you end up doing here is you switch back over to Blade himself, and this is where things start to go sideways, because Blade, who again is now possessed by Varnae, says, I was there in old Atlantis. I was there transcribing the Darkhold, putting its bleak words to paper for the very first time. It was there that I took the first step towards becoming what I will be. And now, with the living Darkhold in my possession, with the blood of a god at hand, and my place of power, I can complete the ritual. And again, the statement that's made by Black Panther here is, I don't understand, which is a weird thing for Black Panther to say because he's like one of the smartest people in the world. But the response of Varnae is, to become a vampire, to create the concept of the vampire, that was only the first step. The vampire was only my pupil form. And he says, no, I was destined for something more. I was destined to be the end of all things. And he says, come, I am in readiness. Come to me, Dark Force. And that's when he starts absorbing all this Dark Force energy into himself. And he says, do you see now? I am become one with the darkness, an entire dimension of darkness. I am become the dark that consumes light, the cold that consumes warmth. I am become a vampire that consumes entire planets, entire stars. I am become the unliving Dark Force. Now, this is kind of a cool thing here, because something Marvel has never done is answering the question, what would happen if a person of incredible power seized control of the entirety of the dimension of Dark Force energy and traveled out into the universe? Could they hold their own against cosmic entities that have the ability to like alter reality and things like that? A part of me wants to say, no, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. But when it comes to something like Dark Force energy, it cannot be penetrated by just standard powers, right? That cannot be done. Otherwise, you would be seeing it done by like Doctor Strange and those guys. Now, as this is going to end the way that it does, I think it flies in the face of that idea. So this whole statement by Varnae could simply just be his ego run away with itself. But what's cool is that in the midst of all this, the moon emerges. Now, the moon has not emerged ever since Khonshu has been locked away. With him being locked away, the moon has been hidden. Now, I'm sure people are going to be like, well, I mean, how does the earth continue on? And like the tides, all that kind of stuff. Who cares? It's comics. Stop asking questions. But what you get is this amazing monologue where Khonshu says, in the darkness and the light, that is what I am. That is what I have always been. And in this darkness, no matter where they may find themselves in the world, travelers by night see the face of Khonshu and they know they are not alone. My dead fists, stirred from their sleep, leap to battle across the world, hands filled with the silvers of my armories, warriors with no fear, no blood, no mercy, and led by my resurrected son. Here's the cool thing, man. So this is something that you learned during Jed McKay's run on Moon Knight. Traditionally in Marvel Comics, every time Mark Spector died, he would just be resurrected by Khonshu. And that was it. It was a way for Marvel to explain how his character could always come back. What you learned is there are a finite number of times in which a Moon Knight will be resurrected by Khonshu. When they're resurrected that final time, if they die, they join the armies of Khonshu's warriors in the afterlife, right? They just stay there and like somebody else becomes a new Moon Knight. That's what was supposed to happen to Mark Spector. When he died, it was his death the final time. Why didn't it happen? Because Marvel's doing Moon Knight in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so they got to bring his character back. That's basically it, right? But at the end of the day, they were never going to permanently kill off Moon Knight anyway. And so while this is not enough, it's cool, but it gets better, because what happens following this is that while Varnae is distracted, Blade basically pulls out a dagger and goes to stab somebody. Then he pulls out another blade and goes to try to attack Varnae himself. And he's basically cast off by Dark Force energy, right? It's just kind of like, okay, like what in the world are you doing here? Like, did you really believe that you could kill me like this? And he says, your blood is my own blood. Tell me, how can you possibly defy me? And the response of Black Panther is, Wakanda's been fighting vampires since forever, right? Do you really believe that our gods had abandoned us? And he says, no, the heart-shaped herb, it's been fighting my infection, healing me bit by bit. Now, this is huge. It's a huge moment in Marvel Comics, and it's very easy to dismiss, right? It's very easy to see it as a plot device, but the reality here is what Marvel is establishing, because you're going to see what happens next. What Marvel's establishing here is the abilities of the heart-shaped herb can be transferred from one person to the next, because what happens here is is that where Varnae says, again, no matter, far too little, and wildly too late, did you really think to kill me with that little blade? The response of Black Panther is, no, I was just removing it so that Thor might join us. And what it meant is that now Thor, with the power of the heart-shaped herb, albeit basically through Black Panther's blood, is able to hold off the infection of Thor and fight against the vampirism in his own blood. It's cool. At least that's what it seems like. But again, Thor emerging from his vampirism comes with the Avengers arriving on the scene to face off against Blade and his forces. But notice this is just a distraction, right? It's just a way to kind of keep Varnae distracted over there so he doesn't understand what's going on over here. Because you switch back to Doctor Doom and his conversation with Doctor Strange. And Clea calls him out, right? She's like, you are utterly without any shame at all. You're maneuvering, your ritual, assembling the children of the Strange Academy from this school, and now this. And the response of Doom is, I alone possess the knowledge of the ritual to turn back the darkness, but I cannot enact it without the mantle of the Sorcerer Supreme. I am going to save the world, Clea, the purpose of the Sorcerer Supreme. And that's where Steven says, he's right. That's the correct statement here. And so Steven simply just says, well done, Doom. You've outmaneuvered me at last. Tell me, did you engineer this entire crisis just for this moment? Now, the thing that he's talking about here, right, as you kind of go through and you have like the Avengers facing off against these guys, right, which isn't the most significant thing, but I mean, it is kind of cool to see. But the thing he's talking about here is it's not the first time that Doctor Doom has orchestrated an entire conflict for the sole purpose of attaining some measure of power. And I'm not talking about, Avengers and New Avengers going into Secret Wars. Doctor Doom causing the incursions was unintentional, right? Once he realized the incursions were happening, he saw that as the lesser of two evils. The greater of those two evils was doing nothing to kill the Molecule Man and allowing the Beyonders to blow up the multiverse. If you don't know what that means, not a great big huge deal. Doom War is the story that I'm talking about, where Doctor Doom secretly orchestrated a coup d'etat in Wakanda by way of a nationalist uprising that saw T'Challa and Storm and all those characters being forced out of their leadership role. All that was done so that Doctor Doom could quietly sneak into the vault of Wakanda and steal its vibranium. That was it. That was the whole motivation behind why all that happened in the first place. And so Doom, basically observing everything that's happening out there, he tells Steven, the Avengers have engaged Varnae and his creatures. The moon god Khonshu is dispatching his dead acolytes around the globe to battle the vampires. It will not be enough. They will lose. This is the only way to win. And so the response of Steven is, okay, fine. You say your aims are noble. Prove it. Prove that I can trust you with this power, that I've been wrong about you. I want your oath, Victor, your solemn word that once the world is saved, you will return to me what is mine. The response of Victor, you have my word, the word of Doom. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar about Doctor Doom, you're just kind of like, well, I mean, of course he's going to go back on his word. No, man. When Doctor Doom gives his word, he gives you his word. But there's a caveat here. So you're not totally off, because Stephen Strange hands over the power of the Sorcerer Supreme to Victor Von Doom. And so in response to this, while everything's going nuts, you jump over to Bloodline and Miles Morales. Now, Bloodline and Miles were the other part of this story, in the sense that it kind of led into it to a degree. Bloodline is the biological daughter of Blade, and he initially hid her away so that nobody would ever know she existed, right? But once vampires started going after her, that Blade realized that she was going to be in danger, so he took her under his wing and trained her to be a vampire killer. But Miles kind of got tossed into them when basically there was a kind of team up between Blade and Bloodline and Miles. And so what happens is that with Bloodline being the biological daughter of Blade, she is seemingly, quote unquote, the only one who can defeat him. Now, it's not in a literal sense, it's really more metaphorical and ceremonial, the idea that she is the means by which all of this will end. And so what happens is that while Blade has all the Avengers basically defeated, you think they'd be smart enough and just not jump headlong into this, that Thor has been without his hammer this entire time. And Thor recalls the hammer to himself. So the entire fight between Blade and the Avengers takes place in the time that Thor's hammer is returning to him. And while the hammer does show up with enough time to be able to allow Thor to jump back on the offensive, it's not enough, right? It is not enough to undo any of this. It does allow Moon Knight to show up here, and Moon Knight's really the one that saves the day because he starts taking out the forces of Blade left and right. Again, it's not enough to destroy them all, but it is enough to hold off their imminent destruction. But again, all of them are ensnared by Blade using its Dark Force energy. And it's like, you guys can't win. I don't know what would have led you to believe that you could. And it's adorable that you did. But the reality here is you are all going to lose. And he says, I had only one weakness, Avengers, the girl, the bloodline, and she's not here. But then like she shows up out of nowhere and just like stabs her father, right? But the reality here is because he's so immensely possessed by Varnae, it doesn't really make much of a difference. And then Miles jumps in and Miles stabs him as well. The cool thing here is that it's not enough to destroy him, but it is enough to break Varnae's concentration. And that's when Dr. Doom is like, now, right? He's literally Goku from like Dragon Ball Z, right? Now's your chance! And just like unloads all this magical energy and strikes at the Dark Force energy. That alongside the Scarlet Witch who shows up with the other magical members of Marvel's universe basically start laying waste to Varnae. And when they do, with the Dark Force energy gone, and because Varnae is a traditional vampire, Varnae is defeated like that, right? That's basically it. Because the defeat of Varnae is not the point of this story. It is not the point of this story, ladies and gentlemen, because yes, they win. The Dark Force energy is cast off. The sun returns. Vampires are actually a little bit different now. One of the cool things that comes out of it is that vampires actually have the ability to walk around in the sun now, which who knows how that's going to play out. And that's going to be a really exciting part of the story. The important thing that comes out of the ending of this is Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, because they have a conversation where Stephen says, that was an incredible piece of magic, Victor. And he says, now your promise, your oath, return to me the mantle of the Sorcerer Supreme. And Doom just kind of looks at him for a second. And Stephen says, your oath, Victor. And the response of Dr. Doom, yes, my oath, to surrender the office of Sorcerer Supreme back to you once I saved the world. And I have only just begun, Stephen. Doom does nothing halfway. And he just like whisks away Stephen Strange's non-corporeal essence. And he says, now let me show you what it means to save the world. Because for those of you guys who have not been reading the news from Marvel Comics, come November, it's one world under Doom. Doom seizes control of the world with his power of the Sorcerer Supreme. At least that seems to be the case. And be ready. With Robert Downey Jr. coming out as Dr. Doom in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you're going to see a boatload of stories that involve his characters. And I am here for it. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.